I am your presenter, Joe Crable, and I'll be giving a live demonstration today of syncing your mobile TracerPlus data with Microsoft Access. The first thing I want to do here is actually create an Access database. So I'm going to create that from scratch. I'm just going to stick it in this folder I have here called Access Webinar. So I'm just going to right-click, click New, and then Microsoft Access Database. And then we can name it, we'll call it Equipment Tracking. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And the first thing we want to do is create some tables. So the type of app I'm going to create today is the check-in and check-out of tools and equipment. So the first table we're going to want is an equipment list. So as you see here, I clicked on my Create tab. I'm going to go to Table Design, and we're going to create our fields here. So the first thing we usually want in an Access database is an auto number ID type field. So we'll just call that ID, and we'll set that to auto number. The next field may be our equipment ID, so I'll just shorten that, Equip ID. Maybe we want a description. And then maybe we want its current status. Is there any comments? Maybe a condition. And then a last activity. So that'll be a date field. So we can basically track the current status of the assets as well as when they were last scanned. So the next thing I want to do is set our primary key. So we'll set our ID field as our primary key. I'll go ahead and click this View field, or View button, I should say. And we're going to save that table. We'll call it Equipment List. All right, so now you see we have our equipment list table right here. So the next thing we want to do is create a transaction table that's going to monitor our check-ins and check-outs of the equipment. So once again, I'm going to come over to Create. I'm going to go Table Design. We'll have our ID field again as an auto number. We'll do our equipment ID, description, do a transaction type, which will be check-in versus check-out. If it's a check-out, we're going to want to know who it's out to. So we'll call this checkout to. Maybe we'll have a comment field, a condition, and a date. And we'll set that as a date time, set our primary key. And you notice I had this checkout to. That's probably one field we may want on our equipment list as well. So after I finish this, I'm going to go ahead and add that to our equipment list. So I'll just click View and save the table as our transaction list. And now we have two tables here. I'm going to go back into our equipment list, and I'm going to click the design view up here in the upper left, and we'll add that checkout to. So actually we'll insert that into here right before comments. We'll call that checkout to. And let's click View to save that. All right, so we have our database here. So now what we want to do is populate it with some data. So I'm just going to enter some dummy data here. So we'll say we have an equipment ID of 1001, description. Let's say it's a Makita cordless drill. And we'll say it's available. Condition, we'll say good. And let's enter another item here. We'll do 1002. And we'll say this is a Porter cable cordless driver. Say that's available. And good. And we'll enter one more item here, 1003. And we'll say that one is a DeWalt portable table saw. Available and good. All right, so now that we have some data here, the next thing we want to do is create an application in TracerPlus that'll actually talk with this database. So I'm going to jump over to our TracerPlus desktop software here, and I'm going to create a new project. We do have some project settings here, so we can name our project. So we'll call it Equipment Tracking. Equipment Tracking V1. As you can see here, we can set certain settings at the project level, whether we're choosing Windows Mobile or an Android device. We will be supporting iOS in the version 10. Choose our operating mode of standard versus professional. And there's some various other settings here, admin, launcher, and connect. So the connect settings we'll be getting into shortly when we configure our sync settings. So I'm going to jump over to session 1 here. So this will be our checkout session. So what we want to do here, so we're doing a checkout, a check-in. So we want to do 3 sessions, one being a checkout, one being a check-in, and then the third and final being a equipment list. So I'll add those 3 sessions. Start with session 3, our equipment list. So if we look at our database, we basically want to emulate the fields in this table into our session. So something new in version 9, we can actually import that. So the first thing I want to do is create a data source for our Access database. That way we can use it in TracerPlus Connect as an ODBC option. So depending on what version of Windows and what, whether it's 32 or 64-bit, accessing the ODBC administrator may be different. So if you are running a 64-bit version of Windows, you will need to use the 32-bit ODBC administrator. So one way we can do this, we can just do a search here for ODBC data sources. You'll see here it comes up as 32-bit. So I'll go ahead and open that. And what we want to do is configure a system DSN. So we'll go ahead and click Add. And we want a Microsoft Access driver. We want to use the MDB ACCDB. We click Finish. Data source name, we can call this Equipment Tracking. And then we want to select the database. So that is located on my desktop. So I'm going to go See, Users, my username, Desktop, and it's under the Access Webinar folder. And once we drill down to that folder it's in, we'll see the database appear on the left-hand side. So we'll click that, hit OK, OK, and then OK one final time. So now, as I was mentioning, new in version 9, we can actually import this field list to kind of make setting up the session a little quicker. So if I click Import, I can select ODBC, I can select our equipment tracking, and then select which table I want to import. So it's equipment list. Then I'll click Import, hit Yes. So there's our fields. We have our ID, equipment ID, description status, checked out to comments, condition, and last activity. This session is really for reference, so we don't need to configure much of it. It's really for lookup purposes for the other 2 sessions. So I'm just going to leave it as is and jump over to session 1. This one I'm going to set up manually. because it's going to be a little bit different than the equipment list and the transaction table, since they're going to be specific fields based on whether it's checked out or checked in. This one will be our checkout. We want to do we'll scan our equipment ID. We'll look up our description. Maybe we'll enter a condition at the time of checkout. Do we have any comments? A status field, which will default to checkout, and then our date. So now let's start defining some of these fields here. So equipment ID, we're just going to scan description. We're going to look up, so we're going to jump over to our lookup options. We're going to enable a lookup to look in the equipment list based on that equipment ID. And we're going to pull in our description. Condition, maybe we'll set that as a drop-down. And we can enter some list items here. Good, fair, poor, and then maybe damaged. Comments will be a plain text field. Status will be checkout. So we'll do a default value of checkout. Mark that as read only. And then date, we'll set a date time field and adjust our format to have both a date and a time. Make that read only. So the next thing we want to do is when we're scanning a transaction, we also want to update our equipment list with the item being checked out and who it's checked out to. So that's one field we want to add here, so I'll insert that. Here's our checked out to. Once again, that can be a drop-down. We can put, some names, John, Joe, Brad, Christine, and Christine. All right, so we want to update our equipment list on who checked this out and that it's actually been checked out. So there's a couple ways to do this. You can actually make this field a lookup as well, but what I like to do is create some hidden fields. So we'll call this update checked out to. We'll call this update condition. Update comments, and update status. And then we also want a date too, so we'll add another field called update date. So these are all going to be hidden, so I'm going to mark these as visible false. And if we come back here, we want to enable the lookups for all these. Because first we want to look up the data, and then we're going to use this update source to actually update with the value that we're going to place in this field. So the way we're going to place a new value in this field is by making it a calculated field. So we'll set our lookup. We're going to look into equipment list based on our equipment ID. Our source field being checked out to, and we want to update that source. So now, what do we want to update that source with? So we want to update or concatenate our checked out to fields into this field. So whatever we enter into checked out to will end up in this update field, and when we submit the record, it's going to then post that update to the equipment list. So we'll do the same for the remaining 4 fields here, so I'll set these all as calculated. And then we'll enable all of our lookups. So equipment list based on equipment ID, and we're looking up our condition. We're going to update our source, and then we're going to get this from our condition field. comments we're going to get from our comments fields. Configure our lookup. Equipment list. Equipment ID. And then comments. Date source. Do our update status. That'll be our status update source, and we're grabbing that from our status. And lastly, we want to grab our date. So that'll be our last activity. All right, so the next thing we want to do is define the flow of the app. So once we scan an equipment ID, where do we want the flow to go? So after scan of equipment ID, we want to go to checked out to, since description will be looked up. After checked out to, we want to go to condition, and then condition can go to comments. And then that's pretty much it in terms of what they're going to fill out. So we can just set this to go to itself, and then make sure we don't have any auto submit set up here. We want to turn that off. So if a person is checking out more than one item, we may want to keep some fields filled out. So such as the checked out to, we can turn off clear on submit so that we can actually check out multiple items to the same person without having to reselect that each time. So I'll turn that off. So that should be it for as far as the field settings are concerned. So we want to just create a quick form here. I'll create a default form. So we'll just align these fields a little bit here, make it look a little bit nice. We can actually hide this tab, so we'll drag that off. And we'll make these fields a little bigger. And we'll drop this down a little bit. Now if we want, we can change our background color here. I'll change it to, say, a blue. Change this to the same color, change our text color to white, and then maybe we'll just change our buttons here. Make them a gray with white text, and then we can even bold that text. All right, so that's our checkout session here. The next thing we want to do is set up our check-in session. We'll go to session 2. It's going to be very similar. So we can even copy our checkout session to make things easier. So I'll actually delete this, highlight our checkout, click this copy session button. You'll see it creates a copy. We'll just move that up, and we'll just change this to check-in. All right, so for check-in, we don't need a checkout to, so we can get rid of that. So we're going to scan our equipment ID. We'll look up our description. We can enter a condition, enter comments. Status will be check-in. We have our date. So the update checked out to, what we want to do here is actually update. Since it's no longer checked out, we just basically want to clear that field. So instead of having it go to the checked out field, we're just going to have it go to a blank constant. So that should clear that field out. Everything else should remain the same. Update condition should be updating the condition to check in. Comments, actually, sorry, condition will be updating just the condition. Comments, and then status will update to check in. We can actually go to our form, remove our checkout to, and we should be good to go here. So let's actually save the project, and let's push it over to our connected device. And I'm using a remote tool called Pocket Controller Pro from SODI. This allows us to remotely control the device. You can also use tools such as Windows Mobile, My Mobiler, or Remote Display Control. So here's our 3 sessions here. So if we look at our checkout session, it should look like our form that we designed. Same with check-in. So we can pretty this up a little bit more. You'll see these refresh buttons, which we don't really need. So if we look at description and date, we want to turn our refresh off. So hide refresh button, we want to set to true. Same for date, set that to true. And we'll set our drop-down field to a size of 14. We'll do the same for checkout. Description, we'll set that to true for hide refresh. And date the same. And we'll select both of our drop-downs and set them to a font size of 14. So now they should look a little better on the device. So if we just push that out real quick. And let's take a look. So that looks a lot better. Got rid of our refresh buttons, and now our drop-downs are sized appropriately. Just take a look at our check-in, and we're good to go. So now the object is to get this data we just added to Access over to TracerPlus in this equipment list. So if we look at view data, we look at our equipment list, we'll see that there's nothing in here right now. So we may even want to display certain fields on this grid. So if we jump over to equipment list, the ID field we don't need in the grid, but maybe we want our equipment ID, our description, status, who it's checked out to, comments, condition, and last activity. So we can just show those in the grid by enabling this checkbox here. If I just push that out again. And let's take a look at our view data. And now here's all our fields that I just enabled. Okay, so now we want to get these synced over. So the first thing I'm going to do is jump over to TracerPlus Connect. I'm going to create a new project. And we want to add a profile. I'm going to click this plus button in the Profile Explorer, and we have the option to create either a sync profile or a live profile. So a sync profile is going to allow you to either batch sync via Cradle or batch sync via a wireless connection, whether that be Wi-Fi or WAN cellular. I'm going to do a sync profile, and then we can marry our desktop project up to this sync profile. This will make the configuration a lot easier. So I'm just going to go to our projects, and it was the equipment tracking V1. Just click that TPP and then create profile. So our first profile, maybe we want to call this sync equipment list. Maybe we want to call this sync to device, actually. So this will be a profile that will contain any processes that we want to sync to the device. So I'll add a process. We'll call this sync equipment list. Now we want to choose a source of where the data is coming from, and then a destination of where we want to send that data. So the source is going to be ODBC, and it's going to be our equipment tracking database. Then we can choose what table we want to sync from. So in this case, we want to sync from our equipment list. On the destination side, we want to sync to TracerPlus, so we're going to select TracerPlus. And then since we married that desktop project, we can choose which session we want to sync to. So we're going to sync to our equipment list. Then we'll look at our mappings here, make sure everything marries up. We don't need to sync the ID field in this case, so I'll just remove that from the mapping. But you'll see everything else here marries up. The last thing we want to configure is our post type options. So once we sync this to TracerPlus, how do we want to update the device? Do we want to append to it? Do we want to override, update, and so on? In this case, I'm just going to overwrite what's currently on the device with what's in the database. You could do an update as well. So that's it for our equipment list. So I'll go ahead and save this. We'll call this equipment tracking. So now I want to create a sync profile that I can sync data from the device. So this way we can actually trigger these two different profiles at different times, because if we're syncing to the device, we don't necessarily want to sync from the device at the same time. So I'm going to create another sync profile pointing it to our same project or desktop project. We'll call this one sync from device. So we'll add our process. So the first thing we want to do maybe is sync checkout. So that's going to be coming from TracerPlus this time, from our checkout session. We're going to go to ODBC, equipment tracking, and our transaction list. Then let's just get our mappings in order here. So we want to sync our equipment ID, description, transaction type. That would be our status in our checkout session. Checked out to, we'll move our comments up, condition, and date. And in this case, we want to append those transactions. Because we're appending, we want to also remove these from the device on a successful sync. So we can come over to the source options and enable this delete after transfer. So now on a successful sync, it's going to remove those records from the device, since we don't need to keep the transaction records on there. We're basically going to do a similar process for the check-in. So we'll add another process. Sync check-in from TracerPlus to our equipment tracking transaction list. Description. So now we have our transaction type is status. Oh, we forgot to change this. This should be check-in. So description, status should be transaction type. We don't need a checkout to in this case. And just the comments, condition, and date. We'll do the same thing. We'll append and then delete. And the last process we want to set up here is update our equipment list. So we want to update equip list. So this is going to update our equipment list based on that equipment ID, if something was checked out or checked back in. So once again, coming from TracerPlus, our equipment list, to our ODBC equipment tracking database equipment list. So we don't need our ID. So we have equipment, description, status. This all looks good. So this time we're going to go to options. We're going to do update existing. And then we need to set a field to update based on. So this is what you want to update that row based on. So in this case, it's just going to be our equipment ID, because that's what we're updating it based on. Go ahead and save that again. So now we have our profiles and processes defined. Now we got to set up how we're actually going to sync this data from TracerPlus. There's a few ways you can actually trigger a sync. The first is if the device is cradled, you can come over to the synchronize page and click one of the profile tabs and hit one of these sync buttons. That's probably our least recommended method, because you can also do a cradle sync via a button on the device. But this is an option for some folks. But if we go back to configure, you'll see that each profile has a unique ID. So this first profile is profile ID 1. This next profile is profile ID 2. So what I'm going to do is set up a couple sync buttons to trigger our different syncs here. So there's a few ways you can do this. You can actually add sync buttons to the sessions themselves. But what I like to do is create a separate sync session. So I'll create a session 4 called sync. We only need one field, so we'll just delete the rest. Jump over to our form designer. In this case, we want to do a blank canvas. So I'm just going to add a button. We'll call this sync to device. This is going to trigger our sync of the first profile. So if we look at our button actions here, we want to set this to a do sync button action. So that will actually trigger a connect sync to take place. And there's a few settings here that can be set for that button. The first being a sync host ID. So that's something we haven't defined yet. So let's jump over to our project settings and then connect. So now we want to define to TracerPlus on the device where connect is and where it should be syncing to. So we need to add a host. Now this can be someone's workstation, or it could be a server somewhere on the network. But it's going to be a PC or server that's running the TracerPlus Connect software. So in this case, I'm just going to enter my IP address here. And you'll see we have a host ID of 1. You can have multiple host IDs, so that's why we have that host ID field. So if we jump back over to our sync, so we now know that we're going to use sync host ID 1, and then we want to sync profile ID 1, which was that profile ID up here. So once we press that button, it's going to trigger that first profile to sync. And we're going to sync that via Wi-Fi. Then we're going to add a sync from device button, so I'm just going to copy this one. Just change it to sync from device. And then we're just going to, the only thing we need to change here is the profile ID that we're syncing. So this one we want to sync profile ID 2, which is our sync from device profile with those 3 processes. Now I'm going to deploy this change out to our device. And if we open Connect and look at our Synchronize tab here, we see an activity monitor. So as we initiate syncs on the device, we should be able to see some activity here. So there's our new sync session. So if I go into it and I click this sync to device, you're going to see some activity take place behind the scenes here. And that should have synced our equipment list up to the device. So let's go check our data. There's our records. Now what we want to do, actually I don't think I actually ever hit enter after that third record, so it didn't take effect. So actually now let me do another sync to get that third record. And now let's check this again. So there's our 3 records. So now let's go ahead and check some of these out. So if we jump over to our checkout, we'll enter our equipment ID 1001. So that's going to look up our description here. So we have Makita cordless drill. We want to check this out to Brad. Its condition is good. Comments, we don't have any, so we'll just go ahead and click submit. Now you'll see, because we turned off that clear on submit, that Brad, the checked out to, is still remaining. So we could check out another item to him. So let's do 1003, good, and submit. So now if I were to sync this back, first we can actually look at our equipment list on the device, and we can see that now the status is updated to checkout. Our checkout to is Brad. Condition good, and our last activity is now populated. So if we wanted to, we could do a sync. So I'll do a sync from device. And that's going to sync our 2 transactions to the transaction table, and then also update our equipment list. There's our 2 transactions. We have our 2 checkouts. We have the ID, the description, the transaction type, who it was checked out to, its condition, and then the date of its activity. And if we look at our activity list, we have our status being updated, as well as who it was checked out to and our last activity. So now let's do a couple check-ins. Jump over to our check-in session. Let's do 1001. Condition, let's say it's poor. Let's see, let's say customer mixed up. And we'll submit that. 1003. We'll say that's good. And let's also go ahead and check out 1002. We'll check this out to Joe. Condition, we'll say it's fair. We'll say missing charger or something to that nature. Hit submit. And if we do a sync, now if we refresh this database, we'll now see the status of the first two items we checked out are set to checked in. Our checked out 2 has been cleared out since it's no longer checked out. We have our comments, customer mixed up, our new condition, and our latest activity, as well as same for our check-in here. Jump over to our transaction list. We should now have 3 more transactions. There's our checkout, and then we have our 2 check-ins here. So now if you wanted to take this a little further, you could create reports based on this. So if you just wanted to do a simple report, we can come over to create. We can go over to our report wizard here. And let's say we want a report of our transaction list, and maybe we just want everything but the ID field here. We can change any types of grouping. I'm not going to get into that. We can actually sort based on certain things. So maybe we want to sort on equipment ID. And you can change the layout of the report. We'll just do a tabular report, and you can also do a portrait versus landscape. Let's do a portrait. And we'll call it transaction list and finish. There, we just created a quick report here to kind of show all of our transactions, and they're sorted by equipment ID. And you also see the report showing up on the left-hand side here. One other thing I want to show you is live mode. So we can actually operate this in real time. So let me actually show you by, let's remove these records. So we'll go to our equipment list. Let's delete these. And you'll also see that check-in and check-out no longer have records because we had that delete after transfer set. So it removed those records on the sync. So let's jump back over to TracerPlus Connect, go to Configure, and now what we want to do is add a new profile, but a live profile. We'll select our project again. You'll see now a live profile is a little different in that it gives you all of these sessions as you would configure which sessions you want in live mode. So actually, the first thing I want to do is add some ID fields to the check-in and check-out sessions. As this makes the live mode work a little bit better if we have these ID fields. So I'll just add those at the end. And I'm just going to re-add this profile. So the first thing, we'll set up our checkout. So we're just basically selecting the source that TracerPlus is talking with. So that will be ODBC. So let's say we wanted to send this to our 10-field sample. And we'll do the same for this. Set our IDs. And we want to set our key fields, which we usually just set to the ID field. And equipment list. And maybe that'll go to our 25 fields. And we'll go ahead and save that. So now we want to enable our 3 sessions for live mode. So we jump back over to Properties, Live Sessions. Then we want to add our 3 sessions here. So our checkout, our check-in, and our equipment list. And our profile ID this time, since we added a 3rd profile, our profile ID is now 3, so that'll be our live profile ID. So we'll set all these to 3. And we'll push that out to the device. And I'm just going to open up our sample database here. So we do include a sample access database with TracerPlus Connect. So you can actually connect with that, and even some of the sample projects in our Solution Center are pre-configured to work with some of those tables in there. All right, let's see, which one is this? So we'll slide that over. So our 25 fields was our item list. So let's see if we can actually copy our equipment list data over to that. All right. Now if we go into our device and we go to equipment list, so you'll see that it made this live connection here. You'll see this icon showing that you're connected. And you'll see that we have 3 records from our equipment list here. As you can see, we had deleted previously those records, so we're actually viewing this data in real time. So if I go to checkout, now we're to scan one of these, it's going to look that up. We're going to change who it's checked out to, say condition of fair, and then we'll submit that. So you'll see that submit happened pretty quickly. So now you'll see it refreshed automatically in the background here, but now this first item has been changed to checkout. Checked out Christine, and it's in fair condition. So this is a good way to actually get real-time data to anyone who may need that data. We can do the same if we go to check in and we check in that item. Say now it's poor and submit. So you'll see that submit took place pretty quickly and then automatically updated our database to check in and then poor. If we look at our 10 field, we should have our 2 transactions there. That's pretty much what I wanted to cover today. I hope you got a lot out of it, and hopefully encourages users to use Microsoft Access a little bit more when Excel is in play, as we would definitely recommend using Access over Excel, especially when using it in live mode or when multiple users need to access the same file, whether it's multiple devices connecting to the same database, or if someone needs to view the database while someone's posting to it with a device. Excel doesn't really give you that support, and that's where the next step up, Access, can really help you in that aspect. So if you do have any questions after this webinar, feel free to give us a shout or check out our forum, as I mentioned before. If you have any questions or topics, that would be a great place to post those. And I want to thank everyone for coming to today's webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.